Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, I will now continue the unfinished story. Chasing the Sound. A Shot at Freedom is a book about life in Hawkins, Indiana. To most people, it's just an idyllic, well-kept American town. But for Eddie Munson, it's like living in an eternally terrifying mausoleum. Luckily, he only has a few months left to survive at Hawkins High School. And what is senior year really about, if not killing time between Dungeons & Dragons with the Hellfire Club and gigs with his band? Eddie meets Paige at the worst bar in town, who works a magical spell. She escapes Hawkins and builds a super cool life for herself working for a record producer in Los Angeles. Not only is she the definition of cool with incredible taste in music, but she may be the only person who truly appreciates him as a poet and not as the embodiment of evil. But the best part, she was offering him a chance to make something of himself, and all he needed was to get her a demo of Corroded Coffin's greatest hits. Just one recording cost money. Eddie didn't have any, but he was willing to do anything, even if it meant relying on his old man, Al Munson. His dad had just stumbled back into his life with another dubious scheme up his sleeve, but Eddie knew this was his only option to make enough money for long enough. It was a risk, but if it worked, he'd finally have a one-way ticket out of Hawkins. 1. The cafeteria's main offerings that night had been sloppy joes and tater tots. The scent of both slightly burned meat and deep-fried potatoes lingered, mixed with the competing cologne, deodorant, and sweat of a packed crowd. The university had made viewing President Nixon's scheduled address to the nation on Vietnam mandatory, as if that would do anything to stop the protesters. Terry thought they were fooling themselves, but she didn't have a diner shift tonight, and so here she was. Elbow to elbow with the people beside her. There wasn't enough room to put her homework on the table. She couldn't complain, not when at least 100 other students had to sit cross-legged on the floor once the actual seats filled up. A TV so small almost no one would be able to see it had been wheeled to the front of the room. Andrew was supposed to meet her here, but he hadn't showed. When Shed called him earlier on the dorm phone, Dave had been in full rant about how unfair it was for the school to decree they had to show respect for Nixon. Maybe Andrew meant to skip it in protest. Hopefully no one would notice. Terry. Stacy called out over the hum of conversation, fighting her way through. Instead of taking a spot at the back, she shimmied between Terry and the stranger beside her and sat on the table itself. Andrew called, she said, leaning forward, ignoring the dirty looks of those around them. He said, "Quiet, please," an administrative type with a microphone said. The microphone was then placed in front of the TV, the volume cranked to maximum. Nixon appeared center screen in the Oval Office, big forehead, bulbous nose. "Good evening, my fellow Americans," he said, the amplification scratchy and booming. Stacy whispered in Terry's ear, "They're coming. Here." "Okay," Terry said, not understanding the urgency in Stacy's voice. "SHHH," a boy on the floor in front of them said over his shoulder. Stacy made a face at the back of his head, but she quieted down. Nixon went on with an explanation of why they were still in Vietnam when he'd promised to get them out. The crowd watched restlessly. The doors at the front of the cafeteria burst open and 3 figures ran through them. Fear blazed through Terry when she saw they were wearing Halloween masks. Then she recognized one of them, Frankenstein. Another was Nixon himself. The third was Superman, the black curl over the forehead. All 3 of the men were wearing masks that had been left behind at Andrew's party. Stacy raised her eyebrows at Terry. "Told you." Pride and concern warred in her as the protesters made a line in front of the TV, arms linked. The administrator descended, telling them they had to leave and calling for security. "Don't listen to him," Dave shouted over Nixon. And then Andrew's voice, "No more lies, end the war." A few students shouted support and chanted, "End the war." A few others shouted for them to let the president talk. Everyone was on their feet, jostling and unsettled. Terry tried to fight her way through the crowd to the front, but it was no use. Security made it first. No, not campus security. The local cops. The police were here. Andrew's last shout before being handcuffed was a slogan Head showed her in a photo of a rally in the Bay Area. Frodo lives. Terry shook her head. Pride flooded her. She loved him like the heroic fools they both were. Terry got to the police station within 30 minutes after the speech ended. The administrator had said anyone who left early could join those who were arrested. Becky wouldn't approve. So Shed waited, vaguely panicked, while Nixon claimed his policies represented a large silent majority of Americans, and that those who protested were a minority who hoped being loud would win the day. Then Shed gone home to get all the cash she had in case she needed bail for Andrew. And now she waited some more in the lobby of a place that reminded her of the Hawkins laboratory. Only less sparkling clean. People came and went, some in uniform. Who were you here for? The officer behind the desk had eyebrows so close together they resulted in permanent disapproval. Terry jumped to her feet, holding her purse to her stomach. Andrew Rich. He's been charged with disturbing the peace and trespassing. The university wants to throw the book at them. She'd been afraid of that. He was already on probation. Focus on the immediate problem. How much to get him out? $100. Shockingly high. Her bank's reluctance to give a young single woman an account suddenly played in Terry's favor. She had ready access to her money, which she kept in an envelope in her underwear drawer. It would take every dime she'd earned from Hawkins, but it was worth it. I'll pay cash. Good, because I'm not taking a check from a young woman without parental approval. My parents are deceased. He had the grace to look down at his desk. Sorry, miss. Terry counted out the money and the officer accepted it. You can sit and wait. She hesitated. ID like a receipt. The disapproving eyebrows shot up, but he wrote her one. He waved a hand toward the waiting area. I'll have someone bring him right out. That turned out to not be exactly true. Terry sat for another half hour before a familiar figure emerged in the company of another officer. She didn't care what they thought. She rushed forward to hug him. Babe, he said low, you should've let me stay overnight. The bail was too much. None of that. She kissed his cheek and dropped her hand into his as she towed him toward the exit. Keeping contact with him felt essential. So did getting out of this place. They shouldn't have arrested you. We knew they probably would. They reached outside and Terry breathed in the fresh air like she was the one who'd spent 2 hours in a cell. You must wonder what I was thinking, Andrew said. I tried to call. It was just the order that we all had to pay attention to this speech. That we have to pretend like it means anything. We had to do something. I know. For Terry, it was that simple. She understood. I thought about you and the lab, how brave you are. He shook his head. This won't be the end of it. Head thought of her. And she knew this wouldn't have a simple end. Let's go home. For tonight, that's the end of it. It wasn't, though. The possible consequences clung to them like shadows. They were quiet in her crappy hand-me-down car as they drove back to Andrew and Dave's apartment. Dave and his other friend had decided to stay overnight in jail. Terry wasn't sure if it was a decision so much as their parents refusing to come bail them out. She pulled into a parking spot and left the car running. Andrew turned and lifted a hand to her cheek. Hey, my rescuer, can I convince you to come and stay tonight? The question lay heavy between them. She could see the need in his eyes. Hers matched it. I thought you'd never ask. The silence from the car followed them into the apartment, into Andrew's bedroom, their lips already touching. They said everything to each other that words couldn't. The threat was any place where their skin didn't touch. The outside world would want to separate them, disrupt what they had together. The threat was in what the school would do to punish Andrew, and in Brenner and the lab's power if Terry had to challenge them. So they fought against the outside the only way they could, by pretending it didn't exist. And for that night, it might as well not have. Who? Terry cut a generous wedge of sugary, custardy Hoosier pie and delivered the round dessert plate to her last active lunch table. She breezed back by the counter and exchanged a nod with Laurie, the other waitress on the day shift, who also made all the pies. "I'm on my break for 10, Terry said. "You got it, sweetie," the older woman said. "Go hang out with your friends." Terry picked up a chair and moved it to the end of the booth where Ken, Gloria, Alice, and Andrew waited after having finished their lunches. BLTs and Cokes all round. They'd been easier to take care of this time, not least because she'd been expecting them. "Why did you want to see us?" Alice asked with zero preliminaries. "Did you come up with an idea?" Andrew nudged her. "Kid sister, you know she did." "Maybe, but only if you agree." Terry kept her voice low. "I'm wondering, assuming I can find some way to get in the wing where I saw Carly." "I think I can help with that part," Alice said. "I watch when Brenner enters his code. 956396. It's the same every time. It probably works on all the keypads in the place, and so it should get you in." A moment of silence. "Alice," Terry said, "you will never stop surprising me. I'll need you to write that down so I can memorize it." "Sure." Alice gave a slightly embarrassed shrug. "I just notice things is all." "What's next in your plan?" Gloria asked. "With that taken care of, if one of you could create a diversion, I might be able to find the girl again and talk to her, assuming she's there. If she's not, maybe I can look for Brenner's office and do some snooping. We know we can't just stop going." "Are you sure about that?" Andrew asked. Terry felt like an exposed nerve. "One, there's a small child taking part in something and we don't know if she's safe. And two," Gloria said, "it won't be that easy. The three of us would flunk out of school, and that's if they let us leave." "What do you mean, let you leave?" Andrew asked, outraged. Terry reached a hand over to remind him to keep his voice down. He lowered it. "You have rights. You're Americans." Gloria smiled wryly. "When it's our government involved, I think you'll find our rights are often to be determined." Andrew absorbed that. "I don't like this." "Welcome to my club," Gloria said. "I'm the chairperson." "Look, I'll do whatever you need," Alice interrupted. "I've been dying to take apart that elevator. I could probably convince them to let me." "Alice isn't even in school. She probably could leave." Andrew again. Gloria cleared her throat. "You can't know that. These are people with resources." Alice sat up straighter. "Don't debate like I don't have a choice. I'm not leaving until everyone does. And I can be the distraction." Ken finally spoke up. "No. You have enough to worry about." "I'll do it." Alice's tone was skeptical. "I rock at distractions, man." He shrugged. "And the acid doesn't do anything to me. I just feel like I need a nap. They just leave some junior guy with me. I'm not even sure why I'm there, except that I'm supposed to be." Alice sighed. "Well, if you're the distraction, just don't fall asleep," Terry said, feeling this meeting about to slip out of her control. "We can figure out timing. I can ask Carly about Papa and what happens to her at the lab. But what if I find Brenner's office instead? I wish I knew what would help us the most in terms of information." Gloria put her elbows on the table. "I might be able to help with that part. If you can get into his office, the best thing would be documents that describe experiment protocols. Also subject records." She frowned. "You might need to find a key. Brenner's not a slouch. Most scientists would lock up classified information." "I can pick a lock," Alice said. "Crap, but then he's too arrogant for us to need to," Terry said. "I bet he takes the protections all around him in Hawkins for granted enough not to worry about the security inside his office." Gloria lifted two crossed fingers. "I think I might be able to grab some samples of the drug cocktail, in case we need it for proof or to analyze somehow." "All right," Terry said. Gloria lifted her eyebrows. "Then we have a very slim, risky plan." "So we do," Terry said. It felt better than not having one, slim or not. Alice nudged Andrew's arm. "I read about your protests, big brother. Can't believe you got arrested. Everything okay? Her obvious concern made Terry's heart grow. This might have been the only 5 minutes today she hadn't spent worrying about him. "I'm fine," Andrew said, ducking his head. "He meets with his advisor and the dean on Friday. We're hoping he gets off because of the other guys," Terry said. Andrew gave her a grateful look. Gloria lifted her fingers again, still crossed. "Yeah," Terry said. "We need all the luck we can get right now." 3. Hen got out of the van last and hurried to catch the others so they could walk to the lab entrance together. The entire approach had grown as familiar to him as his own handwriting. Once outside the city came the cornfields, followed by the woods, and then the chain link and the speed bumps, 1, 2, 3, as they rolled through the security stops and on into the building for their LSD. He felt like he'd seen it in glimpses before they'd made the first drive. He knew the others didn't believe that he was psychic. What people believed didn't matter. The truth did. He didn't see monsters, but he got feelings. Certainty would lodge itself in his chest. He had dreams with snatches of reality mixed in, flashes of intuition. These came unpredictably, which he always thought was funny, and so he was never surprised if an inkling showed up. Or if it didn't. He hadn't been lying when he told the others he knew they'd be important to each other. It's just that was most of what he knew. So, sure, he understood why other people didn't believe he was psychic. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe there just wasn't another good word to describe it. The entry protocol had also taken on a familiar rhythm. Each of the women scanned in with ID cards, then Ken last. The driver usually played escort, bringing them to the elevator where Brenner or one of his staff would meet them. The driver, of course, was also a plant one of Brenner's orderlies who almost always peeled off with Brenner and Terry into whatever room she was taken into. So it went today. When the agreed-upon 2 hours into their trips arrived, and he began to shriek about how the walls were bleeding, the guy assigned to watch him shifted nervously. "They are bleeding, the walls are dripping blood." "Keep it down," the guy said, fidgeting. "Pull an alarm," Ken roared. "You have to tell everyone, invaders, don't you see the blood?" Other man stood in his orderly costume looking around as if someone might help him, but they were alone. It was now that Ken would pull out his big gun, a packet of SOT-Z. He'd bought his mom's Halloween supplies, and when he'd seen this new type of candy in the aisle, it had called to him. He'd bought 3 packs and put them in a desk drawer in his dorm room. He'd known why the moment Terry said she needed a diversion. Heaving and covering his mouth, he put a handful of the candies with the sour exploding centers in and chomped down, then threw his head back so the guy could hear the fizzing sound and see the foam. He jerked as convincingly as he could, imitating his uncle mid-seizure. As anticipated, the practically a kid orderly flipped out. "I think he's got rabies," he said before he rushed out the door. The blood," Ken shouted, barely able to keep from cracking up. He ran out into the hallway and pulled the fire alarm lever on the wall, then darted back into the exam room and proceeded to swallow the remaining SOT-Z and convulse on the floor. The alarm shrieked on, and the orderly finally returned with a tall female doctor who gave Ken one look and said, "We'll have to get Brenner." The orderly did nothing, and she shoved him. "Get Brenner and tell him to bring some sedatives." Ken turned his face toward the floor so he could grin. "Go, Terry, go," he thought. "You can do this." 4. Terry discovered that having comrades in arms and a shared plan made everything feel different. She had both less and more weight on her shoulders. Everyone else believed Brenner might be into something he had no business messing with too. Meeting Carly, followed by the revelation of Alice's monsters and Brenner's electroshock, just gave her more reasons she had to get to the bottom of this. People in this area were conservative, generally speaking. They wouldn't approve of government-funded acid trips. That might be enough to end the whole thing, but even Terry knew they needed proof that wasn't their word against his. And they still didn't have a real idea of what was happening. Hen had promised Shed no when his distraction came. They'd agreed he would time it early enough in the acid trip that Shed still be on the uphill swing and not the downhill tired paranoia spiral. And he didn't lie. A fire alarm screamed and then a young orderly knocked on the door to the room. "Is there an emergency? A fire?" Brenner demanded. Had been pleased at her report that no one knew Shed placed the bug and had seemed to already know it was there. Bless Gloria's quick thinking in actually doing it. I don't think so. I have a patient emergency." The orderly was flustered and babbling. "Doctor Parks sent me to get you. Come quick-o," and she said, "Bring sedatives." "Prepare them," Brenner barked to the orderly attending him, their looming, bearded driver as usual. He walked over to Terry and crouched beside the cot where she reclined. "I want you to stay here and relax. The alarm is all in your mind." "All in my mind," she said, as blissed out as she could manage. "Like pretty music. Let's go." Brenner waved for the orderlies to come. Terry watched through slitted lids. She was up as soon as they cleared the door. The hall was busy with staff evacuating or asking whether they had to evacuate. A security guard passed Terry and said no to one of them, that the alarm system had been manually triggered and there was no evidence of a fire. The threat was being investigated and the alarm would be off soon. She kept her head down and hurried along the wall. A glance into a door and there was Alice, grinning, an enormous machine like a portable iron lung beside her. The route to where she met Carly felt burned into her brain, but she made a wrong turn. Then another. She'd almost given up hope when she recognized the corridor, the wings separated by the keypad. She hurried to it and entered the code Alice had given her. The keypad beeped and the door released with a click. Terry rushed through, past the doors of empty rooms until she reached one with bunk beds and a little table with crayons on it. But Carly was nowhere to be seen. "At least that probably means she's not staying here." Terry hadn't been able to get the horrible idea out of her mind, unlikely as it seemed. So the next step was to try to find Brenner's office. If Carly called him Papa, it must be close by, right? She was either his daughter or important to him in some other way. Terry turned back and tried the other hall past the keypad. She came almost immediately to another set of doors with yet another keypad where the code also worked, and was encouraged when this hallway had offices instead of exam rooms. There were placards with names beside the doors. She scanned each one, praying the letters would stop vibrating and dancing and knowing the acid meant they wouldn't. Dr. Martin Brenner. She traced her fingers across the raised letters. Hallelujah. She tried the door and it opened, unlocked. The fire alarm abruptly stopped, but she knew Ken would do his best to stretch out his disruption. Still, she didn't have endless time. They couldn't afford for Brenner to know what they were up to. Not yet. She tried his middle desk drawer and it was locked. Gloria called that. But then how many files could it hold? There was a tall wooden filing cabinet behind the desk. She said a silent prayer and pulled at the second drawer down. It slid free. She paged through the files, seeing the words MK Ultra and then Indigo typed at the top, along with classified stamps. Neither meant anything to her. She skimmed, looking for the terms Gloria had mentioned, and came up empty. Next drawer, then. Terry's interest spiked as she took in what she'd found. There were no names on these files. Numbers 001, 002, 003, and on they went up to 010. The words Project Indigo after them. More classified stamps at the top of the pages inside. But it was the physical descriptions that told her what she'd found. The low weights. The heights that started at 32. And then the ages listed as entered at age 4, age 6. Age 8. If these were anything to go by, Carly wasn't the only child involved. But involved in what exactly? The notes were mostly focused on the progress of each, and not much had been made apparently, except for the file of 008, which contained encouraging but cautionary notes. You don't have time to read all this. She shut the drawer. Terry's heart pounded as she left the office and hurried down the hall and around a corner, retracing her steps. She chanced looking for Collie again and found her back at the table, drawing once again in a gown. She could have appointments the same day you're here. Before Terry could knock on the door to ask, a hand grabbed her arm. Carly didn't see her as a man in an ill-fitting suit moved her back up the hall. "What are you doing here?" the man asked. "This is a restricted sector." She scrambled for a story. Then she realized Ken had given her the perfect cover. "I heard the alarm and was trying to evacuate." "But how did you get back here?" he pressed. "I'm not sure. I followed someone, I think." She couldn't tell if he bought it. 5. Alice had to stop herself from clapping as the alarm filled the air and glee filled her. A fresh-faced, panicked orderly appeared at the door a moment later and before Dr. Parks could even ask about a fire, begged her to come see another test subject. Ken had managed it. How about that? Alice had been coming up with Plan BS and CS all during the drive here. Thinking those words made giant versions of the letters B and C float through her head as if drawn by skywriters. That was the drugs. No electricity yet today, which meant no monsters either. It had been 2 weeks, maybe the monsters were gone. She closed her eyes and sank into the alarms. What a purposeful sound. Hard to ignore, loud and blaring, perfect for the job they'd been designed to do. Alice appreciated the elegance, which meant she noticed immediately when they stopped. How long had passed she didn't know, but Dr. Parks returned with a sense of flustered distraction about her. What if Terry needed more time? "I want to see Dr. Brenner," Alice said, the BS and CS dancing in her head. "I have something to tell him." "I don't know if that's such a good idea." Dr. Parks frowned over her shoulder at the door. The orderly let himself in. "Go get Dr. Brenner," Alice told him. "I have something to do. I need the electricity." She'd forgotten to look at the clock. Terry had to have as much time as she needed. Every object in the room with a dial or a display pulsed accusingly at Alice. "Get Brenner," she demanded. "Fine, Dr. Parks said. The orderly left. Alice gestured toward the machine that featured in her nightmares. She'd always believed that machines were good, orderly, but had learned here something she should have known. Anything people made, they'd figure out a way to inflict pain with. "Hook it up," she told Dr. Parks. The doctor's lips pursed and she shook her head. She muttered to herself, "Asking for electroshock therapy is not normal." Dr. Brenner entered, annoyance pinching his face. "What? Give me the electricity and I'll describe the monsters to you. I think they're real." Interest chased away the irritation on his face. Dr. Parks finished attaching the wires to Alice. There was sympathy in her eyes. "No," Alice thought, "don't feel sorry for me. I'm running you guys today." She braced for the surge through her, a charge like a battery, and she narrated what she saw. The glimpse of a hazy woodshed walked through with her cousins. Then a pack of dogs on many paws. The half-wild, half-tame dogs she'd grown up with around the garage. Maybe there wouldn't be any monsters, but then they weren't dogs, just like dogs with 4 legs. Snarling, snapping monsters, rainbow light playing in the air around them. Alice opened her eyes to see if Dr. Brenner was still paying attention. "She remains fascinating," he said. He obviously didn't think the monsters were real. And he could be right. She still didn't know. "I have to get back to my subject. I'll expect a full report on anything else of interest today." The effort it had taken to stay focused exhausted Alice. As Dr. Parks removed her connection to the machine, she dozed, or hoped she dozed, because she had pinwheel flashes of the electricity running through Terry instead of her. Electrodes on Terry's temples, and a blurry figure Alice realized was Dr. Brenner standing by as Terry screamed and screamed and screamed. 6. Gloria had come prepared to sneak out of her room and attempt to find a substantial stash of the lab's drugs. But when she touched the doorknob and turned it, she found it locked, even as the fire alarm screeched in panicked abandon. It's not a real fire, she told herself, and counted how long it took them to remember to come for her. 10 minutes. 10 minutes in which she sat in her exam room coiling tighter and tighter with unease. By the time the easily fooled Dr. Green arrived, she half expected them all to get marched into a line, and she didn't know what. Head only informed her there was no actual fire. She hadn't bothered to question the locked door, and at least she hadn't come out of the day entirely empty-handed. She'd already decided to keep her wits about her, and so she'd pocketed her dose of acid and faked the high. She felt paranoid enough as it was. Dr. Green had noticed nothing amiss and had put her through the recitation paces. He really thought he was making some grand progress in showing how interrogation under the influence of drugs could be effective. So she had one dose to show for her efforts. Of course, none of them could say anything on the drive. Conversation had to wait. But by silent agreement they lingered at their cars in the parking lot until the van drove off, then left them and reconvened under the thin glow of security lamps. First off, can we all give the man of the hour some applause? Terry asked, keeping her tone light. Ken took a half bow, folding at the waist, and they applauded, but no one's heart was in it. Gloria thought that they all wanted to know if it had been worth the risk. Well, Alice rocked back and forth from her toes to her heels, vibrating with nerves. Gloria sympathized. Did you find anything? I did, Terry said, but I still don't know what it means. What was it? Alice pressed. I think they're working with children. More than just Carly. But I can't tell what kind of experiments. Whatever they'd expected, it wasn't that. Gloria's hand went to her stomach, which felt sick. She remembered being locked in that room. She didn't trust anyone there with children. What did you find? Folders, like you said, for several kids in some experiment called Indigo. I didn't have time to see if there were detailed notes in them, just a few progress notations. Terry stated this with grim determination. I saw Carly again, too, but I wasn't able to talk to her. She looked healthy. Beauty, it seems clear there is something going on. Well, find out what it is, Alice said, her voice vibrating with the emotion in her promise. Terry asked Gloria, how'd you do? Gloria focused on Alice. Can you teach me how to pick a lock? Alice nodded, frowning. Of course. The kind at the lab. Gloria felt something relax at that. They had me locked in when Ken's alarm went off. Wow, Ken said. It wasn't the best thing to discover, Gloria said. So I wasn't able to get a jackpot, but I palmed my dose. I'll try again next week. So we are going back? Terry asked. We don't have a choice, Gloria said. Nothing's changed. But at least we know where to look for evidence, Terry said, putting a spin on it. Alice's code worked. I'm not giving up. None of us are, Gloria said. Shit, Ken said as a swipe of headlights glanced over them. A van was making a circle. In the dark, Gloria couldn't be sure. Was it the Hawkins van coming back? We'd better go. Be safe, everyone, Terry said. Alice hesitated. Are you all right? She asked Terry. Just fine, don't worry about me. Alice nodded in a way that made Gloria curious about why she'd asked. 7. Dr. Brenner entered the surveillance suite at 8:30 that night. The rows of listening stations were filled with busy staffers. The employee who'd called his office to summon him as directed got up and waved for Brenner to take his seat. They've been talking for about 5 minutes, the man said. He slid his headphones over Dr. Brenner's ears, something Brenner could have done himself. He heard a woman's voice he didn't know asking questions he wasn't interested in, but he'd wait. 8 had been in a tremendous sulk when Head visited her room after the others left. A disconcerting day in which Head been sent this way and that way. He didn't understand it all yet, but his gut told him something was off. His own subject, Terry Ives, had been found wandering the halls far from where Head left her. She'd followed someone into a secure wing far too close to Carly for comfort. The man Ken had reportedly experienced a seizure, but with no evident effects afterward to indicate he had. Brenna had gotten used to the startling mind of the mechanic Townie, but today even she had made demands. The only non-problematic subject was the biologist, and the quiet delivery of information described during her session unsettled him too. Head put in a request to monitor closely the phone lines at Ive's dorm and the boyfriend's house this evening. There'd been something about her innocent act when she returned to him he didn't quite buy. Now had been summoned to hear a conversation with her sister in Larrabee. "Terry, you've hardly said a word, and you called me. What's wrong? Is it Andrew? When does he find out?" "Tomorrow," Terry said. "I wish Head thought it through." A slight crackle on the line. He did. It mattered to him to take a stand. "I don't see why he should keep his nose clean and be glad he's here. He's not going to end the war by wearing a mask into the cafeteria." Terry's annoyance came through in her reply. "Maybe not, but it's better than doing nothing." "That's where we disagree." The sister sighed. "You can't afford to be selfish, either of you." Head heard all he needed to. He removed the headphones and handed them back as he stood. "Thank you. Keep listening to her." He paused. "What's the boyfriend's name?" "Andrew Rich. So I think we finally found it." A new staffer had come in to hail him. The room adjoining the phone monitoring station housed the building's video security feeds. Going through every hour of footage of 8 rooms since their arrival and logging all visitors had proved time-consuming, even with 3 men on it. He stopped in front of a paused monitor, which showed him another piece that went with the conversation Head just heard. Teresa Ives sitting at a table with 8. She wore a gown, so Shed managed to slip away. When he asked, 2 weeks ago, Head underestimated her. He needed to get her back under control. The best way to do that was to distract her, give her bigger problems. He knew everything she cared about most because Shed told him. The solution was obvious. "Good work, men," he said, and went back upstairs to his own office. Once there, he called his contact in DC, the man who could make things happen. "Doctor, Brenna liked men who could make things happen. I have a favor to ask. It's about a young man named Andrew Rich." 8. Terry sat on the sofa waiting for Andrew. Dave waited with her. She'd rushed straight over after her last class, on edge about what the verdict would be. "It'll be all right," Dave said, for the 3rd time. "They just gave me a slap on the wrist." Dave's parents had gotten an attorney friend of the family to contact the university on the boy's behalf. They'd managed to talk away the criminal charges, and everyone hoped any serious ones from the school. An engaged student body that undertakes acts of civil disobedience should be encouraged in this day and age, the argument had gone. Terry imagined that Dave's parents had probably also written a big check to the school. Andrew's family hadn't been thrilled to find him in trouble again. They did not support civil disobedience, though they adored Andrew enough to forgive him anything. They had money, but not the kind of money Dave had been born into. The 3rd friend, Michael, had also gotten a pass, so Terry didn't know why she was this nervous. Andrew would be fine. That made the most sense. Why didn't her roiling stomach believe it? Maybe it was the argument Shed had with Becky the night before. Andrew opened the front door and came in. He went over to the kitchen to grab a beer. He returned and sat, then reclined so his head was on Terry's lap. He looked up at her. "Hi," he said. "This is a good view." She almost smiled. "Thank you. But you're killing us." "What happened?" A blink. Andrew sat up and popped the top on the beer, took a sip. "I'm out." Terry felt numb. "Wait, what out?" "They kicked you out." Dave was shaking his head, shocked. "Please tell me you're joking." Her hands were shaking and she made an effort to still them. "I wish I was." Andrew shrugged. "I knew this could happen. I'll accept the consequences." "The consequences?" "The draft lottery is coming up next week." Terry knew she wasn't helping by saying this, but the words were out before she could stop them. She saw Andrew in a soldier's uniform. This couldn't be happening. "I know," Andrew said. "Well, just have to hope this is my bad luck for now. I'm eligible to reapply in 6 months." I just have to hang on. Dave had gone quieter than Terry had ever seen him. 6 months was an eternity for a healthy person to stay home with a draft coming up. You could go to Canada, she said. No, Andrew said. My family is here. My roots are here. I knew what I was doing. These are the consequences. I won't be a traitor to my country. Dave shook his head again. It's not fair, man. Maybe our lawyer could make some more calls. This is my fault. No, Andrew said. I made my own call. A burst of pride filled Terry. The same pride Shed felt in the cafeteria when they'd run in to protest. But this was more. Andrew might have been spoiled. He might have had an easier time of it than her. But he had grown past that. I love you, she said, blurting it. Andrew smiled. A real smile. I love you too, babe. See, this day's not all bad. But it was. Small victories barely mattered in such big wars. It was a very bad day. 1. From a booth clocked out, Terry watched through the window for the first hint of Alice's muscle car. The second it appeared, Terry shot to her feet and waved goodbye to her co-workers. See you guys tomorrow. Good luck to you and your old man, the cook called back, a chorus echoed by the people in the dining room. Thanks, Terry said, soaking in every well-wish because it couldn't hurt. She ran out to meet Alice and hopped in as soon as the car stopped. Am I late? Alice asked. Right on time, as usual. Terry had to smile. Alice had volunteered to pick up Terry after they both got off work. They were headed to Dave and Andrew's to watch the televised lottery, which would determine the order that men would be drafted going forward. This wasn't a true party, just a small gathering of friends. The occasion was too tense for celebration. Gloria couldn't come, Alice said. Her church is watching together. Did you ask Ken? No, but if he's psychic he doesn't need to watch, does he? Besides, he has a student deferment. Alice guided the car back out to the highway. How was work? The two of them were making small talk. Of all the things. Shed never heard Alice make small talk before, which probably meant she'd only bother with people she truly liked or was comfortable with. Terry smiled again. Busy. Boo. Alice scrubbed a hand over a cheek that still had a touch of grease on it. We had a tricky repair come in this morning and I fought with it all day, but it finally submitted to my charms. Terry would never get used to the way Alice's mind worked. It learned what's good for it. Yes, it did. Alice turned off onto an unfamiliar road to Terry anyway. A shortcut, she explained. It starts at 8. That's what everyone's saying. Terry had been so worried all day she might as well be having an out-of-body experience. If it doesn't go well, Alice said, I have family in Canada. Cousins I'm close with. Not that I'm saying Andrew's a draft dodger or anything like that. Terry snorted. I wish he was. It was my first suggestion, but I think he'll see it through, whatever the verdict. I suppose so. Alice shook her head. Men. Even the good ones make life difficult. She said it with such conviction, Terry wanted to know everything about her sample size. But they were turning onto the apartment complex street already. That was a conversation for a different day. Alice parked and they got out. She pulled up her jacket sleeve and said, still 5 minutes. They hurried on in silence anyway. When they reached the door, Alice went to knock. At the same time Terry spun the knob. We're coming in, Alice called. Babe. Andrew trotted over to drop a kiss on Terry's cheek. He extended his hand to high-five Alice. Her palm met his with a smack. Hey, kid sister, you two made it just in time. He was putting on a good front. He had been since the verdict, kicking him out of school. Job applications had gone out the next day, and he already had an interview for a night manager position at a local motel. But she could see the tightness around his lips, the hint of dark circles from waking at 300 a.m. and staring at the ceiling. Men of armed services eligible age get couch seats. It's a law, Dave said. Stacy stopped fiddling with the TV to swipe a hand up at Terry and Alice. So do their girlfriends, Andrew informed Dave, and they sank into the couch. Alice took the seat beside Terry. I think it's coming on, Andrew said. There was no hiding his nerves anymore. Terry put her hand over his. Stacy reached over to turn up the volume as CBS News cut in with an announcement saying Mayberry RFD was being preempted by a report from anchor Roger Mudd, live at the Selective Service offices in D.C. An array of officials at desks and a large board were behind him. He announced that the first draft lottery to be held in 27 years was beginning. Hear me out, Stacy said, lowering into a seat on the floor. Roger Mudd is smoking hot. He's like your dad's age, Dave countered. Stacy blew on her nails. Doesn't mean it's a lie. What do you say, Ter? I don't see it. Terry half laughed. What about you, Stacy pressed Alice. To each their own. Alice's voice was neutral. So, Roger Mudd's all mine. Anyone know how this works? Stacy asked, ticking her head toward the TV. Mudd explained, as if Head heard her. There was a big fishbowl filled with blue capsules that had been mixed up inside it. Each capsule contained a number, which corresponded to a certain day of the year. They'd be chosen one at a time, and then everyone with the corresponding birthday would know in what order they'd be called to report. First, last, somewhere in between. They're pulling the first number. Andrew clamped Terry's hand in his. A man chose a blue capsule and passed it to one of the people at the desks, who opened it. No one spoke as they waited for the verdict. September 14, the man reading the slip said. September 14 is number 001. Another person in the office moved to the board and wrote the date down as the next capsule was chosen. Terry couldn't breathe. She didn't know what to say. Andrew's grip tightened and she squeezed back. September 14, no September 14s, Dave asked. I say we make this a drinking game. Drink if they don't call your birthday. Then I'm going to have to drink because my birthday is September 14th, Andrew said. He slowly withdrew his hand from Terry's. It seems I'm the first round draft pick. The hush that descended could only be described as horror. Dude, Dave said, and then he burst into tears. Hey man, it's all right, Andrew said, voice taut with strain. No, it's not, Dave said. Terry got up and tugged Andrew with her. Stacy, Alice, I'm going to take Andrew outside for a second. Can you help Dave get it together? Everything seemed to be spinning around her, but she was an expert now. It wasn't acid. It was her world crumbling. Andrew closed the door behind them and they stood on the landing, their breath making puffs of cold air. I'm so sorry, baby, Terry said. They huddled together. I know. We're not sure exactly what it means, she tried. He shook his head, a half laugh. We're pretty sure. I have a couple of months maybe. I'm out of school and I'll be in the first group called up. I'd say we know enough. Terry's throat closed. She needed to talk to him, make it better somehow. But there was nothing to say that could. Look, he said, we have now. We just have to focus on that. She swallowed, nodding. Shouldn't I be comforting you? I can come up with some ideas about how. He waggled his eyebrows. She gave him a little shove. How can you be funny at a time like this? He shrugged. What good is it being anything else? Fair enough, not that any of this was fair. They went back inside, and Dave only cried once more. Terry stayed over, her thoughts constantly returning to the question of how long they had left. 2. Alice floated through space. She'd wondered if her feet needed to touch the ground in the beneath, where the monsters lived, and her friend screamed. They didn't, of course. Feet weren't how you navigated in a dream, especially an acid and electricity-fueled one. She'd been hoping to conjure another vision of Terry, still unsure if it was hallucination, truth, or some sideways version of both. If she could see it again, maybe she could figure it out. But her mind wasn't cooperating. Dry leaves drifted in the windless air like she did, surrounded by grabbing branches and overgrown vines tearing at crumbling walls. Everything was soft, hazy, like being trapped in a dream. Or a trip, she thought. A door hanging, broken, cracked wood split in two like the pieces of a cartoon heart. Beyond it, an empty playground from somewhere she knew. School, church, then it, too, was gone. Indistinct images cycled behind through her head for a seemingly endless while. What did they mean? Nothing Alice understood, and no Terry. But there was a face she recognized. Brenner's. She focused until he wasn't so blurry. Lines at the corners of his eyes. Cruelty at the corners of his mouth. In front of him a rail-thin girl with brown hair clipped short as a boy's in a hospital gown like the one Alice had on, a metallic helmet with wires running out of it on her head. What in the world? The girl tore off the cap of wires. Alice saw numbers on the girl's forearm. 011. What was she witnessing? Yes, witness was the right word. She felt like a witness. Like someone intended to bear witness. An indigo child, just like Terry had said. The girl had to be. Suddenly Alice was in a long hallway, and far at the end, the girl lifted a filmy hand and flung a man in an orderly costume into the wall hard. How was that possible? The vision began to fade. And then it vanished. Alice opened her eyes to her own room at the lab, the machine that made the electricity being rolled away. This place is evil, she said before she could swallow it. She thought of that young girl with the worst of the bad men. Brenner. What had he been doing to her, and was what she'd seen real? Dr. Parks didn't argue with her statement. She slid a finger around Alice's wrist, a light circle tethering her to the here and now. I'm going to take your pulse. 3. Terry hated coming to the lab this week more than ever. She hated being away from Andrew when every moment felt like the last one. It wasn't he still had some time before he'd realistically be called to report for his physical and begin the process of enlisting, let alone be sent to Vietnam, but it felt that way. Brenner gave her a cup of bitter liquid, which she downed. She stuck her hand out for the usual tab of LSD and Brenner handed it over. She placed it on her tongue, ignoring the slightly chemical taste. Something wrong? Brenner asked, the concern in his voice like he cared. Right. Terry would ask him soon about the girl, about the children. Her heart was too wobbly this week, her brain too focused on Andrew. She didn't feel strong enough for another battle, if the questions turned into one. She spat the tab out and dropped it into the small garbage can provided. Nothing I want to talk about. She'd never been overly clingy. In high school, she'd mostly been someone who got serial crushes on boys she was convinced had hidden depths they never did. The shocking thing about Andrew was that she'd expected him not to be interesting. Stacy had casually mentioned she thought they'd like each other. When she introduced them, Terry got even more skeptical. He was too pretty, with those long eyelashes and that brown mane of his impeccably clean car, his off-campus apartment. She'd expected him to turn out to have either an awful personality or a boring one, to be a groping, messy kisser or a snoozerfist who only talked about himself. But Andrew talked about politics, the news, about books, about music. He asked Terry how she was. He listened to the answer. He cared about the world and he cared about her. He was an excellent kisser. She'd felt comfortable with him from the first minute. They'd never talked marriage or long-term. A quiet understanding had built between them, though. The two of them together worked. They needed to have a bigger talk about what this meant for them as a couple. Terry knew that. But she wasn't ready and she wouldn't force it on Andrew. She'd just sit here, taking a psychedelic journey, and obsess. Oh joy. Lie down, Brenner said, cutting into her thoughts like a knife. She did. She'd hardly slept the past few nights, every one of them spent at Andrew's. When he asked if her dorm might notice and object, she'd laughed and said the lab could probably get her out of any trouble over it. So that's where her head was. Not in a good place. At all. She was so tired that reclining on the cot seemed like the best suggestion of her day. She lay back and closed her eyes. Could you sleep through an LSD trip? She could try. A scraping sound on the floor disturbed her. She opened her eyes to find Brenner sitting in a chair, head dragged over too close to the bed. What's going on? She asked. We're going to try something a little different today. Brenner motioned for the orderly to come in. Why don't you go ahead and get her blood samples? Terry sat up. My blood. First session of the month. Remember, we always want to check your levels. Make sure you're healthy and fit, not having a bad reaction to anything. Doctor. Brenna made it sound reasonable, and she did remember them taking blood before. She nodded, her throat dry. The orderly brought 3 empty vials over and she watched the needle slip into her skin and the dark liquid seep out into the first one. He filled it and swapped in another. Her stomach flipped, then steadied. Weird. She never got queasy from a blood draw. That was Becky's problem. Terry would hold her hand and talk to her, distract her, and still Becky would be about to faint by the time it was over. She couldn't stand needles. Terry felt like she was channeling her sister. Whatever Brenna gave her this week must be a particularly strong batch. It usually took longer for the drugs to kick in. Pinwheels whirled at the edges of her vision. Now you have questions for me, Doctor, Brenna said. Terry heard a door open and close, presumably the orderly leaving. Would you like to ask them? Terry would, but her tongue was heavy. Is this a trick? I don't know. Is it? What do you want to know? I want to know what you're doing here. What about Terry? Felt like he'd trapped her. I'd spoil the experiment if I told you. I'm going to need you to take my word for it that our work here is crucial to the safety of our nation. It can't be disrupted for any reason. You understand, don't you? No, I don't, Shed answered honestly. Had she meant to? A frozen part of her went back to thinking about Andrew. Somehow that was almost less scary than whatever this was. Your purpose is not to know, Terry, Brenna continued. Do you understand that? At least there are consequences for your actions, and you should remember that. He paused and leaned in, putting a sheen of sympathy onto his expression. I understand you've gotten some bad news about your young man. Even through the spinning haze at the edges of her vision, what he was saying connected. He couldn't know that, not unless you did it. Again the words slipped free without her meaning to say them. Brenna gazed at her steadily. I bet you don't know what you'll do without him. Say it. That you don't know. She couldn't seem to stop herself. I don't know what I'd do without Andrew. You're going to find out. He smiled at her. Now close your eyes and go deeper like a good girl. I'm done with you for today. Her eyes slipped closed and she fell into a waking dream. Keep going, her brain said. Get as far away from him as you can. A space that was everywhere and nowhere rose around her. A pitch-black void. Her feet were in water. This felt real, not like the drugs. Not like memories. It was safer here, safer than where she'd been. Wasn't it? A hand on her shoulder brought her back to the room where she really was. She expected Brenna, but instead it was Carly. Terry hinged upright and searched, wild-eyed, for Brenna. He wasn't here. She touched Carly's hand. The girl was real. You never came to see me again, Carly said. Terry did her best to process what had happened, what was happening. The edges of her vision spun like plates on fingers, whirling through the air. Don't drop them, don't break. What's wrong with you? Carly asked. Are you sick? The man you call Papa, who is he? Terry asked, searching for her questions. Your father. He's Papa, Carly said, like the answer was obvious and the question dumb. She lowered her voice. He doesn't know I'm here. Oh no. This is dangerous, Terry said, though she couldn't remember why. He'll find you again, but he can't know you're talking to me. He finds out everything. The girl lifted one shoulder. No secrets from Papa. Terry shook her head. There can be. He's just a man. He can't know everything. She paused. Does he hurt you, Papa? Carly frowned, but she didn't answer. If he does, I can help you. Terry had to make her understand. The little girl shook her head. I don't think so. I might be able to help you, though. A field of yellow sunflowers grew up around them, a rainbow arcing over the golden tops. It's beautiful, Terry said. She got up and turned in a circle, smiling. How? She looked over at Carly as the girl reached up to wipe away blood from her nostril. Carly squeezed her eyes shut. The sunflowers began to whip back and forth. The rainbow hurt Terry's eyes. "I'm going to hurt you," Carly said on the heave of a sob. "I have to go." Terry lifted a hand to shield her eyes as the light brightened. Her heart thumped in her chest. This was unreal, but she knew it was happening. "It's okay." "What is this? How can you do that?" "It's easy to do, but not to make it stop," Carly said. "I have to go now." "Wait." Terry reached out for her. Carly pulled away, trembling, shadows replacing the bright lights. They crept around Carly and Terry, formless dark. "No," the girl said. Terry could see in Carly's eyes that she needed to go. "I can help you," Terry said, no longer sure. Carly closed the door to the hall behind her. The shadows went with her. 4. Brenna stood on the other side of dark glass and watched 8 with Terry. The sunflowers were a sentimental touch on 8's part. She could pretend she wasn't drawn to Terry, but she'd revealed the crucial fact that she liked her with that one simple gesture. And then it had escalated beyond Carly's control, as it always did. He had no better diversion to keep 8 occupied than this. In some ways, Terry had done him a favor, had let it play out as long as the benefits outweighed the risks. The children who were exposed to each other did much of the work of entertaining themselves. 8, isolated, wanted nothing more than companions, a family. Had promised her that. Brenner didn't understand children because he didn't feel like he'd ever been a child. Had considered kicking Terry out, but had invested too much effort and already she seemed more malleable, the boyfriend soon to be off to war courtesy of the man in DC. It'd be much more satisfying to break her when the time came. So instead had given her a new truth serum compound with her dosage today to go with his quiet revelation that had been involved in Andrew's drafting and the mental push that she'd not deal well with her beau's departure. Then, with some surprise, had allowed the visit from 8 who'd snuck away from her minder. Again. Had been alerted as soon as it was discovered, of course. A knock on the door behind him, and his orderly entered the small observation room. His bright eyes and the sheet of paper he carried telegraphed that there was some news. "What is it?" Brenner asked. "You're not going to believe this." He passed over the sheet. Brenner skimmed the results of Terry's blood work. Everything looked normal, slightly elevated blood pressure, to be expected. Then he saw. "She's pregnant," he said with genuine wonder. "And this is why you didn't make hasty decisions like kicking someone out for showing the same spirit that made them a good candidate for the experiment in the first place. Now she might develop into a golden goose in more ways than one." He congratulated himself on already having the father out of the way. Tonight he'd bring 8 a piece of cake. He'd tell her that his promise was going to come true. He was finally working on a friend for her. A special friend. His theory had always been that exceptional abilities could be encouraged under the right conditions, but had always had to work with available subjects, none of them clean slates. This child, he could start encouraging the development of this child's abilities now. In utero, every day of her life. Had make sure she was special. Will she have to leave? His orderly was a good soldier, but not the smartest person had ever met. Potential mediocre at best. But he did what he was told without question. Surveillance said the 4 adult subjects were getting closer and that would bear watching. Alice would stay here eventually, when the electroshock reached a point of no return. He wasn't sure about Terry and the others, but had never let the child go. The opposite, Brenner said. We'll want to increase her protocols next week and every week after. We need to keep her close. Tell no one else of this. Yes, sir. 5. Terry knew something upsetting had happened to Alice, too, the instant she saw her. She had a fidgety way about her, all wound up. She'd mess with the straps of her overalls, only to stop and stare down each hall they passed on the way back out to the van. It was late. Their trips had left them tired and reserved, all except Alice. What's up? Terry asked her, keeping her voice down. She couldn't wait for her feet to hit the ground outside. Even surrounded by chain link, she'd breathe easier once they left this place. An image of sunflowers and rainbows and grasping shadows came to her. How had Carly done that, and what was that dark place shed somehow visited the part of her trip that felt both impossible and real? The world was no longer the same as it had been when Thade arrived that morning. A thought of Andrew wormed its way through. She wondered what he was doing right now. Her heart stung as she remembered how soon had begun what Brenna had implied. If he could send Andrew off to war, then what couldn't he do? Later, Alice said. "Come on, ladies," Ken said, and Terry realized they'd fallen behind the group. She looped her arm through Alice's and marched them forward. Once they hit the outside, she inhaled the fresh air like it was perfume. Nothing more was said on the drive home as the landscape rolled by in a dark blur. Terry caught the orderly looking at her in the rearview mirror twice and pretended to sleep. It wasn't hard with fatigue weighing her down. Maybe she even drifted off. When they reached the campus parking lot, the driver hopped out and opened the door for them. They'd gotten back later than usual, and there weren't even the usual few stray students buzzing around. Still, Terry didn't want to risk the van returning if they tried to talk here. "We should go somewhere," Alice said after it pulled away. "Andrews." Terry shook her head. "I don't want to put anything else on his plate. We could go to my parents, but I'm afraid they wouldn't leave us alone long enough to talk," Gloria said. She glanced at Ken. "And Terry and I aren't allowed to have men in the dorms. And I'm not allowed to have women," Ken said. "Or any guests this late." Terry searched for somewhere else. "We can go to my uncle's garage," Alice said. "I have a key." No one objected. And so they made a caravan, Gloria, Terry, and Ken riding together in Gloria's sedan, following Alice and her muscle car out past the edge of town. "Is Alice going to be okay?" Terry asked Ken. She desperately hoped he had an answer, and a positive one. If she was honest, the opportunity to ask was the main reason why she'd volunteered to ride over with Gloria and Ken. "I don't know yet. I wish I did." "Me too," Gloria put in. "We're here." A giant, dinged-up metal sign at the end of a dirt driveway pronounced their arrival at Johnson's Heavy Machinery Repair, Maintenance, and Scrap. Terry had never bothered to imagine the garage where Alice worked, but she'd expected something like where she took her car to be repaired. This was an enormous warehouse, surrounded outside by tractors and bulldozers in pieces and parts. Trucks with wheels that could crush her own car. Eerie, like a graveyard of machines in the quiet dark. She shook her head. "You're losing your grip. Get it together." Then again, maybe it was just the remnants of the day's drugs, and the fact that she'd witnessed something impossible. Shadows draped the front of the warehouse, the lone security light no match for the evening. Alice must have known the way by heart, because she didn't hesitate a step. Terry watched as she approached the building in front of them, and then moments later a broad door swung open and lights blazed inside. "After you," Ken said. Terry and Gloria entered first. The door was wide enough for both, and Terry let out a low whistle. Inside were more of the behemoth machines, towering high, seeming even bigger with a roof over them. The cavernous workshop smelled of oil and grit and sweat. Alice fixed these. She worked on these. She truly was some kind of genius. "Alice, this is really something," Terry said. Alice had her arms folded nervously in on each other. "I know it's not college, but this is incredible," Gloria said. Alice rolled her eyes. "Flattery is unnecessary." Gloria shook her head. "There's a science to this, too. A lot of it." Alice nodded, at last releasing her hold on her arms. She must have been worried they'd poke fun at her. Their tough, fragile Alice. Affection for every single one of these strangers who'd become her friends surged through Terry. There was no one on earth like any of them. "Terry, get yourself together. Remind me I've got a radio I need you to fix," Ken said and winked at Alice. Alice held up her thumb and forefinger and rubbed them together. "Sure, for $10 of filthy lucre, you got it." The mood lightened a touch. "I'm afraid I don't have many chairs to offer you." Alice swept a gaze around the workshop, where Terry saw exactly none. "My uncle says they just encourage people to stick around and pry in your business." She gestured to the concrete and sat propped against the wheel of a bulldozer-like machine. The rest of them eased off their feet. Terry chose crisscross applesauce, propping herself up with a hand to the cool floor at her side. Gloria stepped up and took the padded seat of a medium-sized tractor. Ken crossed his feet at the ankles alongside Terry. "Well," Terry said, when no one spoke, "we're here for a reason. Brenner knows something. Heffit and me." He made it sound like he had something to do with Andrew. "He couldn't have, though," Alice said. "It was a random lottery." Ken rubbed his lip. "The papers are already saying it wasn't as random as it should have been." "Like I said before," Gloria said, "they are people with resources." A surge of emotion washed through Terry, overwhelming. "So it's my fault?" she asked in horror. Gloria jumped in immediately. No one is saying that. It's definitely not your fault." Cold comfort. "I have something else to tell you guys, but, Alice, do you want to go first?" Alice's head bobbed. "I saw something that may be worse than the monsters." "What?" Ken, with interest. "Brenner was with this little girl." Alice recounted to them a story about Brenner and a young girl in a gown with a weird helmet on, a tattoo on her forearm that read 011. And then Alice had seen her using powers, throwing a man with just a gesture. It looked like an experiment. I can't be sure, but it seemed so real. The 011 reminded Terry of the numbers on the files she had found in Brenner's office. Did that mean Carly had a number, too? "Carly came to see me today. She has powers. There's no other way to describe it." Terry briefly outlined their encounter and the abilities she'd demonstrated. To Alice, she said, "I believe what you saw." Gloria said and tugged on her lip. "What did your girl look like, Alice?" "Short brown hair, really short, like one of my brothers, or like it had been shaved and only just started to grow back. My aunt had cancer once. Maybe she was too thin, but she looked healthy." Alice shut her eyes and then reopened them. "Maybe around 12 or 13, pale skin, big, piercing eyes." Terry frowned. She'd just assumed that Alice had seen a vision of Carly. "And your Carly?" Gloria asked. "No," Terry said. "That's not her. Can't be. She's younger." She rolled onto her knees and held up her hand to roughly indicate Carly's height. 5, I'd say. Dark skin. Black hair to her shoulders. "I guess this confirms that there's more than one child there." "How did you know to ask?" she asked Gloria. "The powers you've both described. Obviously I've never heard of anything like that really existing, but if they did, they don't seem the same. Like the same person wouldn't have both of those sets of powers." "You got that from reading comic books?" Ken said. So Gloria asked. "It's odd that you saw the number 011, Terry said, still puzzling over that. "I only remembering seeing files up to 010. Gloria pointed out the obvious. "Maybe he's still bringing in new subjects." "We have to stop this," Alice said with heat. "He's using these kids." "I know it." Agreed. Terry felt like they were missing something crucial. "Alice, do you think you're astral projecting?" "You think Alice saw this as it was happening?" Gloria said. "The girl and Brenner." Alice shrugged helplessly. "It could be. I haven't given enough thought to how it works. There's only one thing to do." Terry wished they understood how any of this worked. They were in uncharted territory. "We need to figure out how many children there are, find out what exactly Brenner is doing with them." Carly said Brenner doesn't hurt her, but she's only 5. "We may need to mount a rescue mission." "We still don't know that he isn't Papa," Ken said softly. "That would be kidnapping." "I said maybe," Terry said. "But fair point. In the meantime, Alice, you see what else you can see." "I can't control it," Alice hedged. "Try. He's got all the advantages. We need to use whatever we have." Terry sounded more confident than she was. "He's not going to make it easy for us to get answers." Alice gave a short nod. She rose to her feet and put out a hand. "If we're the Fellowship, I want to be Galadriel," she declared. Terry got up too. "Galadriel isn't in the Fellowship." "I don't care," Alice said. "There are not that many women to choose from in the books." I want to be Galadriel. Ken stowed. And Brenna's the enemy. Gloria shook her head and hopped down to join them. Am I the only one who hasn't read these books, whatever they are? Yes, Alice and Ken said together. Alice gave him an approving nod. For once. Put your hands in, everyone, Alice said. They did. Now what? Ken asked. Now on one, Terry said, thinking back to high school football games and the huddle, to the fellowship of the lab. The laughter was uneasy. The kind of laughter that comes when nothing is actually funny. 6. Terry closed her eyes a week later and waited patiently for the drugs to kick in. She'd been tired for a few more days, and then some sort of renewed energy had filled her during the past 2. Almost like anticipation. Could she find the void like last time? Brenna had been smug and solicitous and given her a compliment of vitamins to take home. That was new. Some of the drugs we're testing may have side effects: abdominal swelling or nausea. Let me know if they do. Don't visit your usual doctor because they won't know what to do. At any rate, these should help your brain recover from the paces we put it through here. Thanks, Shed said, and bit her tongue on asking why they were being put through the paces and whether the gifted children he had here got vitamins too. Maybe they got those new Flintstones ones. Whatever the case, she'd throw them away as soon as she got home. Now he might have been telling her to go deeper, but Terry's concentration was such that it didn't penetrate. She actively didn't listen to the sound of his parody of a soothing voice. She breathed and she looked inside herself, and then she imagined going further. She travelled over a desert that turned into the tile of the hallway outside, and then into ice that made her feet so cold she shivered. The first water she reached belonged to a beach, sand between her toes, an ocean from a vacation one summer. They'd shared a motel a block from the waves with one of her dad's soldier buddies and his family. Terry had eavesdropped on the mothers sitting with their heads together at the outside tables at night while the kids exhausted themselves on the diving board. They hardly remembered that Terry wasn't a diver, and so she could linger and catch snatches of conversation. Nightmares. Yes, sometimes so bad he doesn't sleep for days. Does he take it out on you? On the girls. These formed a large part of her idea of adulthood. Now, wandering through an acid test, she decided that yes, she'd been right, but it was also far weirder. That was when the darkness she'd been seeking surrounded her. The nowhere everywhere. How long it had taken to get there, she didn't know. But memories, that yearning in them, somehow she thought memory and the void were similar. A space that connected people. No smell, no taste. There was nothing here, nothing but Terry. Until she saw a face in front of her. Gloria. A light in the darkness. The other woman sat with her eyes closed. Gloria, wake up, Terry whispered. She gave no indication of seeing or hearing Terry. And then she was gone between one breath and the next. Terry kept walking, feet splashing in the water. But nothing else came. She was alone. Eventually, Terry opened her eyes and pretended to tell Dr. Brenner the secrets of her past on cue. The less he knew about this newfound ability of hers, whatever it was, the better. He never left the room, and so there was no way of getting to Carly again. 7. The oven made the small kitchen at home overly warm and completely cozy. The radio blared big band Christmas music, and, for once, Terry was okay with that. Don't do it, Andrew teased. Don't kill again. Terry plucked a still warm gingerbread man off the baking sheet, held it aloft, and bit off its head. Poor Mr. Bread. Andrew shook his head sadly. Mr. Bread, she asked around the mouthful. First name Ginger. Last name Bread. Or it was, until he died via the sudden loss of